Thanks, Liam. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Clinton Institute and to Catherine, who's helped us set this up today. Very nice to be in this very august institution, pretty impressive. The books are real. Where I live right now in LA, the books probably wouldn't be real, they'd be sort of plastic effigies, but delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I think the role of a war correspondent is and should be. I think it's a very relevant question today because we're seeing some pretty nasty wars going on, and the whole question of how we can cover them, I think, has become paramount, particularly with the ISIS phenomenon in Syria. I don't know how many of you read War and Peace, all 1,225 pages of it. But for those of you who have, when you get to the end, you might recall in the postscript, Tolstoy asks the question, why did millions of people begin to kill each other? Because he couldn't work out who told him to start this. He goes through a whole series of potential reasons why this might have happened. And at the end, he decides that there is no plausible explanation for why this war started. And you think, really? After 1,200 pages, you're not going to tell me why? Leo, can't you do better than that? And it's that question, I think, that dogs us even today with wars, trying to work out what makes them start, how do you stop them? And I think that's where I'm going to take the talk today. I think that's probably the role of a foreign correspondent. As Liam said, I grew up in Limerick. In my childhood, there was always the background of the Troubles, as we call them in Northern Ireland. I left in 1985 to become a foreign correspondent. I studied philosophy at UCD, along with German and Greek. And the basic aim of philosophy is to ask the question, why? Why do we do the things we do? And I decided pretty early on I didn't want to be a professor of philosophy, and the career options weren't great, that aside. But journalism, if you think about it, it's sort of the same thing. You're really asking, why do we do what we do? You're trying to understand what it is that makes people do what they do. And so I sort of use that blueprint, if you like, to develop a career as a foreign correspondent. And I ended up covering quite a lot of conflicts. I didn't set out to be a war correspondent. In fact, most of the people I know who've done this didn't really set out to be a war correspondent. What usually happens is you end up in a country where some conflict breaks out and you start doing the reporting. And once you've done one war, then the editors say, well, send that guy McCarthy, he knows how to behave in a war. And so it becomes self-replicating. And that's really what happened to me. I went to Central America. That was the big story in the mid-'80s. Reagan was president. He famously said the communists were one day's truck drive away from Texas. And so we had to fight the communists in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and that went on for quite some time. Then I moved to Asia, and I was in Bangkok, but the stories then were the war in Cambodia, there was a coup and a civil war in Burma, there were coups in the Philippines, there was fighting then in East Timor, there was a war in Sri Lanka, and so I sort of found myself being sent to more and more of these conflicts. And I always ask myself the question, not only why are they doing this, but why am I doing this? Because there's always a danger in war reporting of veering towards the side of war porn, as they call it, being a voyeur. I had a very disturbing experience in Jakarta in 1998. That was the time when Suharto was basically being pushed out of power. Indonesia, as you know, is a majority Muslim country. And generally they live pretty peacefully with there's a Christian minority there, but at times of stress, it's usually the minorities that get dumped on. And at that time, there was this sort of campaign against Christians in Jakarta. And it was one Saturday afternoon where we witnessed in a small little back street, really, in southern Jakarta, the lynching of a Christian guy from Ambon by a group of Muslim Indonesians who had these long, sharpened bamboo spears. And they were stabbing this guy, and he was lying on the ground. And I was there with a photographer from Time magazine. And at one point, I had to ask myself, why am I actually here? And what am I contributing to to the understanding of Indonesia by watching this poor man being killed. I had an interpreter who was trying to explain to them, this is not Islam, you really don't need to do this, but once a crowd gets into a frenzy, it's very hard to stop that, actually quite scary. Anyway, this poor fellow died, and we had a story in Time magazine, but that question has stayed with me for pretty much for the rest of my career. Why am I doing this? And is there any value in reporting on these grotesque atrocities, which every war produces? So I just put that in your mind, because I'm going to come back to that sort of question. Are you bearing witness? Are you a voyeur? Because I think it's important to differentiate that in your own mind as a foreign correspondent. Conrad has that character Kurtz in The Heart of Darkness, whose famous words were the horror. And you remember Apocalypse Now reprises that. There's something about the horror which both repels and attracts, and you find yourself drawn to it. And I think the same phenomenon we're seeing today with these videos from Syria, the ISIS beheading videos, the drowning videos, the crucifixion videos. One has to question, how much of this should one really be watching? Marie Colvin was a colleague. Some of you might remember her. She worked for the Sunday Times since 1985. She was the one with the eye patch, an eye that she lost in the war in Sri Lanka. She used to turn up at all these awful places too, in East Timor, and I saw her a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan. She went into Syria, into Homs in 2012. Baba al-Amr is one of the neighborhoods in Homs, which was being very badly targeted by the Assad forces, with pretty indiscriminate shooting of civilians, snipers, and so on. And she was trying to report on that at great personal risk. On February the 12th, I think it was, in 2012, the house she was staying in was shelled. And there's some considerable reason to believe that it was actually targeted by Assad's forces, because they knew that she was there. They were able to zero in on her satellite phone. Up until the moment she died, pretty much, she'd been sending out reports by the satellite phone on how these civilians were being killed. And this shell came in, one shell came in, hit the house. They tried to evacuate. She ran outside to get her shoes, and the second shell killed her, along with a French journalist. And you sort of wonder, again, why was she doing that? It was a tremendous risk she was taking. That was 2012. Since then, another 200,000 Syrians have been killed in that war. Her very moving reporting didn't stop the war. Was her life lost in vain? Was there any reason for her to even try that? Another question that I sort of ponder about. I've had a number of colleagues who've been killed, and some who've lost various limbs in reporting the wars, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have been pretty bad, and Syria now for foreign correspondents. And I would say that my conclusion is that it's not a waste of time, because despite the continuing war in Syria, at least we know what's going on there, and there is some pressure, mounting pressure on policymakers around the world to address this. If you reflect for a minute, the most grotesque atrocities of the last 100 years, I'm thinking of the extermination of 6 million Jews in the concentration camps in Germany, the purges in Stalin's Russia, maybe 20 million dead, the loss of life in Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, probably the single greatest loss of life of all, about maybe 35 million people dead there. Pol Pot's killing fields, a smaller number, 1.7 million, but percentage-wise, maybe 20% of the entire population of Cambodia. All of these atrocities were carried out in the complete absence of the media. There was no reporting until afterwards. We had some sense, there was a sense that bad things were happening to Jews in Germany. Cambodia was really a sealed story until the refugees started to come out at the very end. Who knew what was happening in the gulags? And the same with Mao's China. So I think that for that very reason alone, the fact that there are still correspondents like Marie Colvin and others who are prepared to go into these very dangerous places and bear witness, it helps at least maybe to put a ceiling on what's happening. We need to do something here, because nothing was done in Cambodia until the Vietnamese finally invaded for their own reasons in 1979. Nothing was done to stop the killings in Germany or in China or in Russia. The other crucial function, I think, that war correspondents can play, and this is a slightly more complex one, is to help to disentangle myth from reality. The first war correspondent probably in history, I think you could argue, was Thucydides, who lived back in 460, from 460 to 395 BC. And he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. And he actually took the trouble to go to see the Peloponnesian War and to talk to some people. He spent a lot of time interviewing people. He quotes at length. One might dispute whether his quotes were indeed verbatim, but that's an editing question that we sort of don't have to go into right now. But at least he made an attempt to get to the truth. And he wrote in his history, and I'll quote, "Most people, in fact, will not take the trouble in finding out the truth, but are more inclined to accept the first story they hear." And I think that's something it's well worth keeping in mind when you start to talk about wars, because wars, more than anything, generate enormous rumors. Any of you who've been in a conflict situation will know the terrifying spate of rumors that go back and forth. The army is coming, they're not coming, the bombs are going to come, the planes are coming, there are landmines there, no, they're not there, they're there. Wars are very uncertain environments. People often don't know what is going to happen to them in the next 20 minutes, let alone in coming days and weeks. And so information becomes extremely hard to verify. Distortions of reality are quite remarkable. The people who are waging wars deliberately distort reality. You will always see a demonization of the enemy. In the Iraq War, for example, the narrative that was fed to us in the US was of the semi-heroic American liberators who put down Saddam, and the Baathists, who were these evil Nazis, and therefore they needed to be purged from society. That narrative was not really an accurate one. In fact, by creating this idea of the Ba'ath Party as the equivalent of the Nazi Party who had to be purged, we effectively then created the insurgency, because we pushed them out, gave them nowhere to go, and they realized they had no future in Iraq as we had reconstituted it. And so that became the insurgency, which is now, through several iterations, become ISIS. It was interesting to watch that. In 2003, I was in Kuwait, and there were, on the day that the US went across the berm, northern Kuwait into Iraq in March, there were 775 journalists embedded with US forces. Tremendous number, 775. The American soldiers who had to carry these guys with them were sort of wondering how many more are going to come. There were very few who were not embedded, and I was one of them, and it wasn't because I'm particularly heroic nor individually minded. I had been assigned by Time magazine to be embedded with the 101st Airborne, who were going to come in from Turkey. And then at the last minute, the Turks basically said they didn't want to be part of this fight, and so the 101st Airborne was stood down, and I was sitting around in Kuwait with nothing to do. So I said to New York, I'll just go in with we hired a four-wheel drive. We lied to the Kuwaitis, yes, we're just going to the beach. You get it back 3 months later with bullet holes. And we crossed the border. And that first week, you'll recall there was this extraordinary thunder run straight up to Baghdad. Tanks through the desert, Marines charging one side, third ID charging the other side, made for great TV. There was some fantastic footage on CNN where the camera's bouncing up and down, there's gunfire, and the correspondent is ducking and coming out. It looked great. That weekend, Time magazine in those days was published on Monday, so it would go to bed on Saturday night, Friday, late Friday, early Saturday, and Saturday night for revisions. The main story on the war had 5 or 6 correspondents for Time magazine contributing to it. And there were some great passages describing what life was like in the desert, what it was like charging through Nasiriyah and getting shot at, what it was like getting closer to Baghdad, the bombing campaign at night. And there was nothing from the Iraqis. And the reason was not that the Time magazine journalists were biased or they didn't want to know what the Iraqis were thinking, but because they were all embedded, apart from me. When you're on a Bradley or a tank and you've got big guns and 50 caliber machine guns, no Iraqi in his right mind is going to come anywhere close to the American forces. So it meant that nobody was actually able to talk to Iraqis. And I think that was, for me, one of the discoveries that was interesting about the embed process. Nobody's really asking the basic questions about this war, which is, do the Iraqis really want us here? Because they couldn't, because they didn't have any Iraqis to talk to. And that model sort of perpetuated itself through the war, and particularly when it got more dangerous to travel around Iraq, US correspondents became sort of tied at the hip to the American military. And it's important to understand that there wasn't really an attempt by the US military to censor the embedded journalists. And the embedded journalists themselves, I don't think, and I went on various embeds and I did later in Afghanistan, I never felt that what I did was being somehow controlled by the US military. It was just the very fact of being embedded put you in a certain perspective to the war, which was very hard to self-correct because you didn't have access to any opposite point of view. And so that was something that was troubling to me at the time. And I remember having a conversation that first week of the Iraq War with my editors in New York, saying, I think we need a sidebar. I was near Basra and I'd spoken to some Shiites who were concerned about a rerun of the first Gulf War, where, if you remember, George H.W. Bush sort of pushed the Republican Guard out, encouraged the Shiites to revolt, and then we basically let them down. And there was great fear this was going to happen again. I said, we need to get some of this into our story, or at least a sidebar, because you need an Iraqi voice in here. And they finally agreed to that. But my bigger point is that the way the war was covered was very unbalanced, and it wasn't deliberately unbalanced, it was just that was the way it happened because of the embed procedure. I think that's something that it's a lesson that still really hasn't sunk in fully, how your perspective is conditioned by where you report from. And it's been made harder in Afghanistan because, frankly, you can't go very far in Afghanistan without US forces. It's just too dangerous. Another myth that I think is very hard to challenge, but is important to challenge for foreign correspondents, is this notion that somehow the heroes can march into a country, solve whatever problem it is, and get out unscathed. And I'm thinking of the type of mythologizing that we see in Hollywood. Some of you have probably seen the movie Zero Dark 30, Catherine Bigelow's film about the killing of bin Laden. So it's based on reality, it's true. The SEALs, the Navy SEALs that dropped into that compound in Abbottabad, they killed bin Laden. None of them were even injured, let alone killed. And so there was zero cost to the US, and they were airlifted out, even though they lost a helicopter. And it seemed to be a great success. Well, yes, it was to a certain degree. But again, the bigger idea here that we can wage war against our chosen enemies at no cost to ourselves, I think is a fallacy and needs to be challenged. But the resistance in the news media is really quite remarkable. And I'll I'll give you an example. I spent quite some time in Afghanistan embedded with the US Marines in Helmand province, which is down in the south, and was the most dangerous province for the US. The largest number of American casualties all occurred in Helmand province, which is why they sent the Marines there, because they always send the Marines to the toughest areas. We basically embedded for an entire year with one battalion of Marines, and so they got to know us pretty well. And they allowed us to go anywhere we wanted to go, right up to the front. And in the course of our reporting, we were there on several separate occasions. We filmed 3 Marines being killed, blown up, and several others being maimed. What was pretty shocking to me when we brought this footage back to New York, the executive producer of CBS News, Rick Kaplan, didn't want to show it. Now, I understand that there are some issues of taste here, and you know, the ISIS beheading videos have raised that question again. But we were able to pixelate the more gory parts of these injured and dead, mutilated Marines. What the real issue was, and it was one of these sort of implicit debates, it was never made, but the real issue was they didn't want to scare away the advertisers. It's not good business to have dead or injured Americans on network TV. And we had a huge argument about this, and I said, you know, it's in my book, it's crucial that we are able to show the costs to the US military in this war, because people need to know that when you pull that trigger or when you give the green light for a war, there will be costs to the US. There is no cost-free war, or any other country for that matter. I'm talking the US just because that was where I was reporting at the time. There has been an increasing shift in the US to think that our military can solve anything. We're great, these supermen, these special forces, and they are very good. They're very well trained, some of the best in the world. But even the SEALs and Delta Force, they lose guys. And when you commit a big army, you send 200,000-300,000 troops into a country, you're going to lose people. I'm not a pacifist. I think there are some wars that need to be fought. But I think that we need to think very hard before we do that about what the costs will be. And you've seen some of the debates in Congress recently, particularly about Iran, where a certain segment of Congress think we shouldn't have any deal with Iran, we should probably just bomb them. That's dangerous thinking, because there are significant costs, and I don't have to go into them, but you know, the damage that would do to the Middle East and to the US are pretty significant. So I think that this myth that we can wage war at no cost is something that needs to be very vigorously exploded. And one of the ways that I think is most effective is when we have ongoing conflicts, to show the cost of these conflicts. And if you think about it, you don't actually see a lot of American casualties either on TV or in the print media. They will show dead Taliban or dead Al-Qaeda guys. There's this reluctance to show dead or injured Americans or their allies. Under George W. Bush, they didn't even want to show the coffins covered in American flags, because that was felt to be demoralizing. I strongly object to that. There are costs to wars, and we should be aware of them as we decide what we're going to do in the future. The other thing that I think, in terms of demythologizing wars, all wars pretty much end with negotiations of some form or other. And it's very hard to negotiate with somebody whom you think is a demon, inhuman, and irrational, and almost subhuman. The type of rhetoric that we use against our enemies is predictable. We talk about Syria, sort of Assad is bad, ISIS is worse. I don't know if that makes Al-Qaeda the good guys because they're fighting Assad. I don't think so. But at some point, that war has to end, and it'll only end when we negotiate, and at some point, that means negotiating with bad people. If you don't understand what motivates them, it's going to be very hard to start some negotiations. So ISIS, for example, regularly described in the media as brutal, inhuman killers. And they are. It's horrible what they do. But there are reasons for what they do. Largely, going back to the Iraq War, ISIS is basically a vicious outgrowth of the Sunni opposition who feel disenfranchised by the Shiites that we put in power in Baghdad, and will fight as long as they can. We somehow have to come to terms with that, because bombing ISIS is not going to end their war. The only way we will defang ISIS is by persuading the Baghdad government to bring some Sunnis back into the fold, and then their sort of civilian support will ebb away. But until we do that, there will be no solution to ISIS. We're not going to defeat ISIS militarily, not where they are right now. And I think that general observation applies to pretty much any conflict you like. Israel-Palestine. There are people who think that Israelis have a biblical right to all the territories that they want to occupy. There are people that think the Palestinians have an absolute right to all the territory that the Israelis stole from them. As long as that dialogue of the death continues, there will be no two-state solution. It's not possible. Again, the task there for the foreign correspondent, the war correspondent, is to somehow get behind these stereotypes and explain, well, yes, both sides have a point. Until we understand that, we can't really move forwards. So I think that's as far as I'll take it. In deference to Tolstoy, who couldn't think of a reason why that war started and couldn't probably work out how to end it, the damage that Napoleon and the French Revolution and the various upheavals caused Europe were solved by talks. The Congress of Vienna in 1815. And everyone sat at the table and they bashed it out. I think that right now in the Middle East, that is the only way that we'll find some peaceful solution to these horrible conflicts, not just Syria, but we have the related conflicts in Iraq, and you know, you're going to see the same thing happening in Afghanistan too. But for the Middle East, people are going to have to sit down and talk, and they can't talk if they're not informed. And I think it's the job of the war correspondent to inform what should be a constructive debate, and not what we see now as more this name calling, which is really not getting us anywhere. We understand that ISIS are bad, yes, I get that. But if you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, you're not going to stop them. And so that to me is if you like, an outline of what the war correspondent can do. He can help demythologize the war, and he can help explain why people do what they do, and he or she can bear witness to some of the worst atrocities, because if we don't, then they will continue and get worse and worse and worse, as we've seen in some of the major conflicts. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to take your questions. I was proud to have spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent, a lot of it covering conflict. I learned a lot. It was pretty humbling, but I have to believe that question, the fundamental question of why people are doing what they're doing, has to be answered, and you have to have some exposure to these people and take the kind of risks that Marie Colvin took to answer that question why. Thank you very much.